We're fortunate today to have Mr. Bryan Tuma here to speak with us. Mr. Tuma is the Assistant Director of the Nebraska Emergency Management Agency. In that role, he is responsible for the day-to-day operation of that agency, oversees the state's response to state and federally declared disasters and emergencies. Mr. Tuma is a graduate of the FBI National Academy, and more importantly, he's a graduate of UNL. He has a degree in criminal justice. We were laughing today. He graduated in the last century, as did I. Prior to assuming his current position some 5 years ago, he served in the State Patrol for 32 years. And Mr. Tuma was the superintendent. He was the head of the State Patrol in Nebraska for 7 years. Mr. Tuma.
Can everybody hear me? Sounds like I've got plenty of volume. Okay, first of all, thank you for allowing me to be here today. So what I've done is try to break this presentation up into a couple different pieces. I'll start with just an overview of emergency management, the discipline, and that kind of gives you a blueprint for how we approach things when we do have emergencies or disasters. Then I specifically wanted to talk to you about the event that occurred this spring, the 2019 flooding, and where we're at with that event, some of the impacts that we saw, and how we're looking at that in terms of recovery and some other programs that we do. I would encourage questions at any point. I'm going to apologize. I told Chris I picked up a heck of a sinus infection this year, so I'm going to be struggling a little bit. So hopefully everything everything up here doesn't cause me problems. Okay, let's start with just an overview on preparedness and how the folks in the United States look at this. And I'm talking about individuals, businesses, and then government. And this statistic up here is really almost alarming. So when disaster strikes, that's an article that appeared in the publication Governing, which is a pretty good document or a periodical that comes out, and it really provides some timely updates on the issues that are impacting state, local, and federal government. So this was one of the articles they did here about 18 months ago. And they did a survey of government jurisdictions about where they were at with preparedness and how they approached those issues. And if you can look at the data up here, 28% folks said they were highly prepared. About 60%, or about 2/3, folks said they were somewhat prepared. And then the rest of the folks, the other remaining 12%, quite honestly, I don't think they had any idea if they were prepared or not. And the most alarming thing here is 144 government officials were surveyed. 57% of those folks said they'd already been impacted by some type of significant event. So the question obviously is, if government agencies or entities of government are indicating that they're not prepared or only somewhat prepared, so where are you at in terms of if you are in the midst of a major event, a major emergency or disaster, and how well can you respond to all the issues that you're going to face? So that's pretty scary. And then there's some other information from this survey where they looked at individuals and their perceptions about what they would do if they were confronted with if they were impacted by an emergency or disaster, something catastrophic. Here's what most folks say. We'll pick up the phone, we'll get on the internet, we'll get on social media, and we'll ask for help, because somebody will come and help us. And the reality, folks, is if it's a major event, you're going to have to help yourself for a period of time, because government simply does not, either local, state, or federal, simply does not have the capacity to address all the issues that are going to impact individuals and businesses at least for the first 72 hours and beyond. So people need to really adopt a preparedness strategy, what it looks like for them if they are confronted by some type of an event. What have they done to kind of lay in the groundwork for being able to sustain themselves for a short period of time until help can arrive, when it's feasible for help to arrive, and then look at recovery issues as well. So my goals today simply, again, give you kind of an overview of emergency management, the discipline, talk about a few of the things that we look at, and then also I want to kind of break this down into preparedness, response, and recovery. And I think the best way to do that is look at what happened with the flooding event this spring. And I'll just stop talking if you want me to, and I'll answer questions if you prefer that format as well. So a little bit about our state emergency management agency. We are part of the military department. Major General Darrell Bohack is my boss. He is the director of emergency management by state statute. So he is not only the adjutant general for the military, the National Guard folks, both Air and Army, but he is also, by statute, the director of emergency management. So my role, my responsibility, I'm responsible for day-to-day operations. And you know, I'll just simply say this. The general essentially gives me full latitude to run the agency. He is there when I need assistance, and he's been a great partner. We work very well together. But we're located in this facility. This is Joint Forces Headquarters. If you drive by on Interstate 80 out on the west edge of Lincoln, look towards the airport, you'll see this facility. It's fairly prominent. It's a newer facility, moved in there about 2012. And so it's the headquarters for the general and his Air and Army counterparts, but it's also the headquarters for NEMA. So our State Emergency Response Center is warehoused in that facility. Okay, some phases of emergency management. Typically when we talk about that as a discipline, there's 4 areas or 4 phases that we typically look at. The first one is preparedness. Preparedness simply meaning you have to have a plan. Typically that involves planning, training, exercise, getting people to communicate, establishing those relationships. When I talk about emergency management, oftentimes I simply refer to it as the discipline of building relationships and stakeholder engagement. You have to know who your partners are, and that may be in government as well as the private sector or non-government entities. So we work with all of them. Mitigation is an activity that we are going to see more emphasis on in the future. That program is separate from, it's one of our recovery programs, but it's separate from rebuilding public infrastructure. Mitigation is really that activity where we try to harden or enhance infrastructure or to move infrastructure out of harm's way. So if we have a future event, the impact is lessened. And statistically, they look at that program on a national level. For every $1 that's invested, you get about a $6 to $7 return on investment. So when we look at the number of disasters that we have in the United States and the impact in terms of the fiscal impact to the government, if we can reduce the cost of disasters by mitigation activities, that's a good investment. Next area is response. Typically a response in our world is that first 72 hours. That's when you're really focused on saving lives, protecting property. You are in the midst of an event. You are doing the things to coordinate resources or personnel, equipment to try and mitigate or trying to respond to that event. So that's really life-saving, protecting property. And then recovery is that long process that follows. And for the spring event, you know, I had several conversations with the governor. His comment was, you know, I think we did a pretty good job on the response to this event, but he goes, we're going to be judged on the recovery. And that's very true. And this is the big challenge right now. And I'll give you some information on where we're at in terms of the impact of that event historically and how we're proceeding with recovery activities. But typically we are involved with repairing or rebuilding public infrastructure. So roads and bridges and buildings, or we're helping to repay entities for some of their response costs. How much did it cost to get the fire, the police, and other folks out there to help save and protect lives? Your personnel costs, your equipment costs, and some of those other items that folks need to be reimbursed for. We call it emergency work. Okay, so how do we put this all together in terms of the state of Nebraska? So there are a series of statutes that comprise the Emergency Management Act. And it does talk about the framework of emergency management for the state of Nebraska, the roles and responsibilities, some of our planning, our response, all those issues that we just talked about. Those are outlined in that series of statutes. So I don't expect you to memorize any of that, or I'm just simply showing you here that there are statutes that break down who has the authority for emergency management, who's responsible for those activities, and the governor really is the chief official, elected official that's responsible for that for the state. But it also spells out the fact that local elected officials are responsible for their jurisdictions. We don't come in and take over your event. We don't run your event. We come in and we provide you resources. So once the event exceeds your capacity or your capability to deal with it, people raise their hand at the local level and say we need assistance. And the state of Nebraska will do the same thing. For instance, the floods. When we were overwhelmed by the types of resources that we need and the impact of it, and we raised our hands, said, FEMA, federal government, we need help. And so this act outlines that issue. The resources are available through the state of Nebraska. The governor has full control over those resources, so all of our state agency counterparts, our fellow state agencies, have resources that the governor can bring to the fight. And our job in our State Emergency Operations Center during a response to an event is to really coordinate those resources. And we have a process by which we do that, but the important thing to know is that the governor has a lot of statutory authority to respond to an event. Can short circuit some of the more tedious issues with regards to government, the oversight and the overwhelming bureaucracy sometimes, and cut to the chase and get resources made available. So that's very important. And as I mentioned, it does define the roles and responsibilities, not just for state government, but for our local jurisdictions, our local entities of government, and how they can respond to these events, and what their roles and responsibilities are. So as I mentioned, the governor has a lot of authority for instance, issuing declarations. So a local entity will say, we need help, we're gonna declare a state of emergency. That's the prerequisite. That really sets the stage for us to be able to respond. And they say, we need state assistance. Then the governor will issue an emergency declaration, and that empowers us to use the governor's emergency fund and the other resources of state government to come to their aid and assistance. Suspend regulatory rules, again, cutting through the red tape to get things that need to be done, deploying resources and equipment and materials through the state agencies, and also to organize the control of the military department and other state agencies. So traditionally, if you look back historically, the National Guard played a very vital role in protecting citizens across our state, many, many years ago. And so the Guard was the governor's militia to respond to issues and events. And then eventually that transitioned into the civil defense era, and then we transitioned now to the emergency management concept. So the Guard has always played a very prominent role in bringing assistance to local jurisdictions. So the question is, who's responsible for keeping communities safe? It is the chief elected officials in those jurisdictions. They rely on local emergency management officials that work for them, and then also citizens. So, everybody has to work together. It's a team concept. If one of those entities does not want to play well, then we're going to have problems. So communities are really responsible for preparing themselves and responding to disasters or emergencies. So the most effective approach, when we look at this, is it's the whole community approach. It's bringing together citizens, first responders, the local emergency management officials, non-government organizations, and we deal with volunteer groups, faith-based organizations, and what we call non-government organizations and the private sector. Those groups are an absolute necessity in terms of response. They're not bound by a lot of statutory requirements or policy or other administrative regulations. They can go out and they can do recovery work, and they fill a vital role. Without them, we couldn't get things done. And then we also work with our other state representatives and our federal officials as well. So we at the state, NEMA, we are trying to deal with the issues with our local jurisdictions. If we need assistance, then we're typically reaching out to FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Agency. There is a patchwork of emergency management officials at the local level across the state. The requirement by statute is that every county has to be has to have an emergency manager, an emergency management official. How that gets accomplished is really kind of a patchwork. So in some cases, we have a dedicated local official. The county hires that individual. That's their primary responsibility. Some cases, they assign that individual multiple roles and responsibilities. So I'm not trying to poke fun at anybody, but they may be the county weed superintendent, but they may also, their primary duty may be to the local county emergency manager. In some cases, counties group together and they'll form what's called a region, and they'll pool their resources as a region, and they'll hire one individual, and maybe they'll have a couple volunteer assistant directors. My point here is that they can accomplish this in a variety of ways, but every county has to have somebody identified to be their emergency manager. So we talk about our approach to emergency management, and probably one of the most important elements that we have to look at is how do you look at all the issues? And we operate from what's called an all hazards perspective. All hazards meaning, we deal with the weather events, flood, fires, tornadoes, and those things, but we also deal with things like cybersecurity, terrorism, and whatever else. So we have to look at the weather events, obviously, and we're no stranger to any of those. So that one up here is, a typical winter blizzard. This is flooding from 2011. This is the town of Pilger, 2014. The Pilger tornado went through there. And then this is a wildfire, 2012, out in the Panhandle, northwest corner of the state of Nebraska. But we also look at things like chemicals. So Nebraska being a very heavy ag state, most of our economy is generated through ag business, ag industry. We have a lot of chemical issues in our state, not just with applying chemicals out in the field, that type of thing, but also in the processing and manufacturing of other products further downstream. So ammonia facilities, propane, anhydrous ammonia, transportation accidents with chemicals and other materials. We certainly have to be prepared to respond to those issues. This is probably one of the issues that's getting a lot of more emphasis now is cybersecurity. And so we look at it from a number of perspectives. Is it the lone wolf up here who's trying to hack into people's networks? Is it, I'll call them the less organized but diligent folks that try to hack? Or is it some group, some entity, individuals who have a political or social agenda and they're trying to target certain, is it private business, government, whomever? So those threats are very real. We've had several incidents in Nebraska where communities have been the victim of ransomware attacks. In some cases, it shut down their information systems to the point where they couldn't deliver essential services. And we've responded to that. We have a mechanism where we employ cybersecurity teams. We try to essentially stop the bleed or put a compress on that so that we can stabilize their system. And then we bring in third-party vendors, or if they have the capacity at the local level, they fix their problem. But there have been a number of ransomware attacks. This is occurring more and more frequent. And on a national level, our groups, our state directors, federal folks are all looking at the cybersecurity issues being one of the more important issues we need to really look at. This is an issue that also is gaining a lot of attention. So these mass shooting events, so the Las Vegas event a couple years ago, we're no stranger to it in Nebraska, the Von Mar shootings. School shooting, I think, was yesterday or the day before out in California. So that phenomenon exists, and so there's a lot of emphasis placed on our private sectors and our school organizations really taking a look at preparedness measures, being able to respond to these types of threats. So we're working more and more with those partners. So we tell folks, in the private sector, in government, so are you focused on this, the workplace environment, or do you ever consider this? Because the threat is real. We all know it. Okay, let me talk about disasters in Nebraska. So this chart simply reflects the number of disasters that we had in our state since 1960, and there's 64 events up there. What I don't have on there is the 2019 data, and of course we had the flood, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, but 64 events. Nebraska kind of leads the nation in the number of federally declared disasters, so that's kind of an interesting, a little factoid for you. Most of these are all weather-related events, but we're certainly no stranger to dealing with federally declared disasters. And this next chart really depicts maybe some alarming trends. So if you look at that, those are 10-year increments, the number of declarations in each of those 10-year periods. Since the year 2000, we've had almost 2/3 of our events been declared in that time frame. So again, most of these are weather events, so you draw your own conclusions from that. So we have been extremely busy for the last 20 years with federally declared disasters. So most of them, again, are weather-related phenomenon. This just breaks down the type of weather activity or event that occurred. And so we're not immune from ice storms, obviously, and wildfires, but flooding and tornadoes, they lead the list. Flooding far and away. Okay, I do want to talk about our spring event. So prior to the March timeframe, we knew that the conditions were very ripe for major flooding. We'd had an extremely severe cold weather. We had a lot of precipitation. Most of our rivers and tributaries were all frozen. And we knew that if we had a rapid warm-up that we were really going to have some issues with rapid runoff. And those rivers and streams would simply not have the capacity to carry that water. The other issue that we were dealing with was the Missouri River system, and that's a network of dams. We call it the Upper Missouri River Basin. Starts in Montana, comes through North Dakota, South Dakota, into Nebraska. 5 major reservoirs on that system. All of them were full of water. All of them couldn't purge the water out of the system fast enough. And when you dumped all the runoff from all the tributaries and rivers in Nebraska into one river system, things are not going to go well. And that's what happened. So another little interesting factoid is Nebraska has the most miles of river of any state in the United States. So got a lot of rivers. So that was kind of the scenario. So we knew going into the March timeframe we were going to have problems. And we were working with a lot of local communities trying to look at preemptive measures that would help them with flood fighting. And when we had what is termed the bomb cyclone event, which I'm told by weather folks is that's not really a true weather phenomenon. It's just a severe low pressure system that impacted our state. So we had this rapid warm up, had all this runoff. And so on March 12th, the governor declared a state disaster declaration. Followed very quickly by on the 19th of March, we submitted a request to FEMA that ultimately goes to the president for a major disaster declaration. And we were seeking both a declaration for what's called individual assistance, which is to help individuals with some unmet needs or other needs that they may have, to get them through the response phase and into recovery. And then also for public assistance, which is rebuilding public infrastructure. So we submitted that on the 19th of March. We did what's called an expedited request for a federal declaration. We'd never done that before, and quite honestly, most states don't try that approach. We did, and within 2 days, the president signed our declaration for both IA and PA, and I'll just tell you this, that's unprecedented. That doesn't happen, but it did. So we got a lot of help from the federal folks before the event, and then right away we transitioned into the declarations, and we had FEMA personnel working in our staff during the response, and then we very quickly stood up what's called the Joint Field Office to support FEMA operations. So we knew we were going to have a lot of problems because very early on we could see the impact from this event. We knew we had a lot of folks, individuals that were heavily impacted with housing issues and flooding and damage. but we also could see the damage that was occurring to public infrastructure, our roads, our bridges, water, wastewater treatment facilities. So we knew it was bad. And so we wanted to get the help in here as quickly as we could. So we had an original disaster period starting March 9th to April 1st. And things didn't stop happening. In our state, we continued to have flooding. And then in the May time frame, the typical tornado, severe thunderstorm season, that activity began. And so we were beginning to see multiple impacts just about every week. And so we requested FEMA to reconsider opening up our original disaster period, extending that to July 14th. And again, that doesn't happen every day in our world, and they did it. So that was a big help for us. So the original declaration, we had 50-some counties, or excuse me, 60-some counties that were in the original declaration. The way this has all ended up is we have 84 out of our 93 counties are covered under the Public Assistance Declaration, and 5 tribal nations. And for the Individual Assistance Declaration, we have 29 counties and 1 tribal nation. So you can see this was truly a statewide event. The impact is pretty significant, and we'll be dealing with the recovery issues for quite some time. So this map, this is really a FEMA document, and you can see it's dated June 28th. So the way their FEMA areas are structured, that hasn't changed, but the number of counties is up to 84 counties, and this just depicts the counties that were eligible for public assistance. And then in some cases, the pink or the salmon colored counties, they were eligible for both PA and IA. So, you visually, you take a look at that map and you go, pretty substantial. Individual assistance, what does that program do? As I mentioned before, in a lot of cases, individuals were impacted. Government really can't come to your aid and restore everything. We can't make you whole. But we can provide some assistance that will help people get started down the path of recovery. So obviously we bring in FEMA folks who are versed in the individual assistance program. There are some opportunities to provide direct cash payments to folks for things like temporary housing, food, sheltering, daycare. We also provide some state dollars for that program. So if you have funeral expenses, you need, your car was destroyed, you need a vehicle, those types of things, we can help people get them on the path to recovery. Individual assistance, when we get that declaration, we automatically bring in the Small Business Administration. The SBA can provide very low interest loans to help people with housing, to replace housing, or to repair it. And we can also get loans for small business owners to give them sufficient capital that they can get back on their feet, get their businesses restored, and on the road to recovery. And then renters are also eligible for assistance under that. So if we have people that live in apartments or they're renting homes and they're impacted, there are programs available for them under the SBA. And then we bring in our volunteer organizations active in disasters, what we call VOAD, our non-government organizations and private sector. And we bring them into what's called a disaster recovery center. So we physically move those centers around the state of Nebraska into the local areas. People can sign up for individual assistance. FEMA and state folks will meet with those individuals, explain the programs. If they need loans or other financial assistance, we get them signed up, we get those loans processed, and we start getting resources in the hands of folks to get them on the road to recovery. So this is dated just a little bit. So there's individual assistance through FEMA, which folks can be eligible up to about $34,000 in financial assistance. So there were about 7,000 claims for individual assistance through FEMA, $26.5 million paid out in assistance. Flood insurance. So obviously you have to have a flood insurance policy to be eligible to file a claim. So we had roughly just a little over 1,000 claims submitted, and the loans to date, it's up over $40 million, I can tell you that. So interesting thing about flood insurance, we went back and we looked at the number of policies that were in place in Nebraska prior to this event. So in 2014, there were about 14,000 policies, flood insurance policies that were active in the state of Nebraska. We looked at the number of policies that were in effect in 2019, and it was down to 8,700. So that's a concern. So when we look at flood-prone areas and floodplains, the cost for folks to get flood insurance, in some cases, it's a deal breaker. Folks make a decision that they're going to roll the dice and not have a flood and be impacted because they simply can't afford the flood insurance. So on a national level, the flood insurance program is administered by FEMA. FEMA's struggling with how do we make this program more affordable to folks so that we encourage folks to get flood insurance so they have that coverage. If they're impacted, they can have some coverage, some benefits. So that's a big challenge for us. And we're trying to work with the federal folks and state officials, try to take a look at flood insurance and how we can make it more affordable. The other problem I think that we're going to have with flood insurance issues is this event we're going to remap the state of Nebraska for floodplains. We know that. The floodplains are going to look different than they have. And so one of the things that we heard from a lot of folks that were flooded was, well, I was not in a floodplain and my insurance carrier told me I didn't have to have flood insurance. But yet when you look where they were living, they were literally a stone's throw or within eyesight of a river or a stream. And so their potential to be impacted by flooding was there, but for some reason they weren't in a floodplain, they didn't have flood insurance. SBA loans, it's up over $47 million now that the SBA has provided for low interest loans to help people recover. Housing was kind of a unique issue for this event. So the most impacted counties were in this is one of our more populated areas of the state. We have 4 counties where over 1 million people reside. Our populations are right around 2 million. So half the people in our state live in that 4-county area. So Sarpy, Douglas, and Dodge and Cass County, those counties, they had almost 77% of all the housing issues that were impacted by flooding. The most impacted cities, you can see them up there, those aren't all of them. I can tell you there were communities up in Boyd County, Lynch, for example, about 100 homes in that community, over 60 of them were impacted by flooding. And we had other smaller communities that were impacted as well. St. Edward was another one. But 77.5% of our housing stock in the state is essentially single-family housing. About 15% of the housing stock is trailers, mobile homes, but yet they represented 51% of the most severe damage. So I'll give you an example. Bellevue, just outside of Offutt Air Force Base, there were 2 trailer parks, mobile home parks, 600 units between those 2 parks. Virtually every one of those trailers in that area were destroyed, and I mean destroyed. They're actually condemned the trailers, condemned the parks, and there's an effort underway to demolish all those mobile homes, and they're going to acquire the land. That's probably going to be green space in the future, but 600 homes were impacted in just that small area. So it's pretty substantial. We formed a state housing task force to help look at these issues. It's a part of our long-term recovery strategy. The state will get what's called Community Development Block Grant funding. You get that on a blue sky day, but during a disaster or following a major disaster, we will get additional money for disaster recovery. So right now we think we're probably going to get about $150 to $160 million in disaster recovery for community development block grants. And it can be used for planning, rebuilding housing, all kinds of issues. It's more general. It allows us greater flexibility to use those dollars. So how do you apply that much money for all these issues? So we've put together a long-term recovery strategy, or we're doing that now. We've hired a contractor to help us do that, and we're working with stakeholders to try to put together that plan. How are we going to use all these resources to help the state recover? Public assistance. So that was the program I mentioned that rebuilds public infrastructure. So typically it's government buildings, something that's owned by, in the public sector, not the private sector, by individuals. So we typically look at 7 categories of work in that program. The first 2 are emergency work. That's repaying jurisdictions for their response costs or helping to address debris management issues. Getting rid of flood debris, tornadoes, it's always, you know, what do you do with all the trees and all the other debris left over from an event like that? So we have a plan for emergency work to do that. And then there's the permanent repairs, the bridges, the roads, water control, so wastewater, water treatment facilities were heavily impacted in our spring event. Buildings, equipment, utilities, and parks and recreation facilities. So this heat map, it's a little old, it's September. The data up here, the numbers, they probably have changed a little bit, but the impact, it's the same. It's the same. So you get a pretty good idea. The darker colored counties are the ones that had more significant impact, and the lighter colored counties less. But it gives you a pretty good idea of where all the damage occurred from that spring event. And you know, if you were to, overlay the river systems in Nebraska, so it would look something like a hand with all the rivers coming together, ultimately ending up here. You get some idea what happened. All that water was coming into the Missouri River system, and we were simply overwhelmed. I know you probably can't read that. You might be able to a little bit. But so this data over here, I had already gone over that. So we're about $114, $115 million in federal assistance been paid out to help individuals. But this gives you an idea where we're at with projects for public assistance. And I'll just kind of summarize it. Right now we're looking at about it fluctuates, about $425 million in infrastructure costs. So I'll put that into perspective for you. So FEMA writes the project. They work with the local entity or the jurisdiction, the applicant. They write the project. That project then goes through a review and approval process, goes to a cost recovery center in Denton, Texas. They review the projects. They ultimately obligate the dollars for that project. So everything that you see in here is estimated. It's all estimates. We don't know. We have submitted, well, you can see up here the number of payments that have been made. To date, we've only paid out about $2 million in payments. So the big challenge, and this is not just Nebraska, this is across the United States. Trying to get projects written, reviewed, approved, obligated, and the speed at which that's occurring to get money back in the hands of local jurisdictions that have been impacted. This is a reimbursement program. It's not a, here's your money, go do your thing. No, it's you go do your thing, repair it, fix it, incur the cost, and then we'll give you the money back to reimburse you. So a typical project, 75% of the cost is reimbursed. That comes from FEMA. 25%, or that balance, 12.5% is paid by the state of Nebraska through the Governor's Emergency Fund, and then 12.5% by the applicant, by the recipient. Excuse me. So right now we're looking at somewhere around $425 million. That figure is going to fluctuate up and down because, again, we're dealing with estimates. As we go through this process, it's going to take a while. Yeah, I think you can see we're 9 months out from this event, and we've not really obligated a lot of dollars back to local jurisdictions. That's a big concern for us, and we're trying to work through a couple strategies to fix that. The other issue is we'll be doing this for a long time. I'll give you an example. Katrina is still an open disaster. That occurred in 2005. When you get into these major projects, if they involve water, land, so you got environmental, historical issues that have to be vetted. You got procurement issues that have to be addressed. You've got engineering studies. In some cases, if you're rebuilding a building or whatever, you've got the design, the architecture, the engineering services that are required to develop those projects. Typically, those are very expensive projects, and they just simply take time. And I will simply tell you this. FEMA will come back later and they will audit that project. And it's not unheard of for FEMA to find a cost that probably wasn't eligible but was approved, and they will come back to the local entity, the subrecipient, and say, you owe us $5 million because that wasn't approved. And that happens. You know, the goal is get it right the first time. So that takes a little bit of time to get those issues resolved. So when you look at the cost of the disaster, we think it's going to be right around $400 million for public assistance. The state of Nebraska will have a 12.5% cost share, a financial liability associated with that. So we're prepared right now to go in and request a deficit appropriation for roughly $50 million. That's a lot of money. And so we'll see where we go with that. But we do know we have that responsibility, we have that cost share, and we're going to have to address it. Okay, so some of these photos you may have seen. Flooding's flooding, you know, I get it. But this is probably one of the more iconic photos. That is the Spencer Dam on the Niobrara River. This is the Highway 281 bridge. The river never used to be over here. It used to be over here. And so this is the dam that gave way. There was a wall of ice and water that built up behind that dam. When it let go, it destroyed the dam. It caused extensive damage to this bridge, and that water and ice went downstream and hit the community of Niobrara. The other problem with this area was the water supply for 4 communities in Boyd County is a water line that goes through the river, and that water line was destroyed by the ice. And so it took 4 months to do a boring operation underneath the riverbed, restore that pipeline, and get water service restored back to those 4 communities. So difficult project. Okay, this is the community of Niobrara. This is the ice flow that came downstream from the Spencer Dam. Gives you some idea of the power behind all that water and ice. So these are metal buildings adjacent west edge of Niobrara. And this is just the ice field. This is Governor Ricketts standing on Highway 12, right on the west edge of Niobrara. Gives you some perspective on the size of the ice that was coming downstream. And this was not infrequent. So we flew the state of Nebraska, the National Guard flew the governor, myself, and several other officials around to survey damage. So these are cattle, all in here. And this scenario was not unusual. A lot of cattle, a lot of livestock mortality associated with this event. We think somewhere in terms of ag impact, right around $1 billion total. That's livestock, lost crops, damage to land. In some cases, we had stored grain that was destroyed. So one of the things that we did with this event was we had an ask with the USDA, United States Department of Agriculture, and they sent teams in, and they literally flew the state of Nebraska and were doing surveillance operations to identify missing, stranded, isolated herds, or to identify dead livestock. And so we had a lot of reports of livestock washing up in people's property, you know, recreation properties downstream on the river, and you know, suddenly the landowner says, hey, my cabin's got 12 dead cattle laying in the yard. What do I do with them? So we had to have a process or a mechanism in place to deal with that. So our USDA officials flew the state, they identified those areas, they teamed up with our State Department of Agriculture and our Nebraska Department of Environment and Energy, and they went out and they assisted the property owners or the owners of the livestock to make arrangements for disposal. Some cases they were buried on site, some cases they were taken to a landfill, but you know, that was quite an extensive operation. This was the Elkhorn River, and When you're flying over that, I think there were areas at times where it was 8 to 10 miles wide water. And so the damage to cropland, the siltation that occurred, in a lot of cases, I shouldn't say a lot, there are cases where we have so much silt deposited on ag land that the cost to remove that exceeds the value of the property. So what are you going to do? Now there are some programs through the USDA where they'll do reclamation work. In some cases it'll be feasible to get rid of that sand and silt. You know, the short term, that land is not productive, can't be used in production. It will take maybe 2, 3, 4 years for that to occur. Or in some cases that land is just no longer suitable for ag. So, you know, and you've got fences, you've got irrigation systems, you've got farms with all their outbuildings and their equipment, all that was destroyed. Roads and bridges at the county level took a heavy impact. 60% of our public assistance projects are county roads and bridges. We know that we'll be spending quite a few years rebuilding bridges at the county level. And those county roads, that network of transportation, that is the lifeblood of our state. It's the farm to market roads. And it's the roads that the folks that live in the rural areas of the state rely on to get to school, to get to work in some cases, to carry on commerce, and really it's their economic lifeline. So the emphasis has really been on trying to restore that county road infrastructure. You know, and a lot of housing stock, folks that live in the rural areas, their acreages or their farmsteads, heavily impacted by flooding. And our local communities in those areas also heavily impacted. So we're working with a number of communities. They're standing up long-term recovery groups for themselves. In some cases, we have regional groups that are looking at that issue. How do we leverage recovery dollars and programs to really get areas back on their feet? Community resiliency. How do you restore the tax base? How do you get those essential services back? Restore the public infrastructure. We have one community that's actually looking at relocating. So Winslow is that community. They're actually talking about moving the town. And this is not unusual. Niobrara has moved 2 times in the past because of flooding. So they were closer to the Missouri and now they're not so much. They're back up on the hill more. But this gives you some idea. I can't remember if that's Winslow or Arlington. But that gives you some idea what they were dealing with. Pretty significant. So that's our facility. That's Joint Forces Headquarters. That's where we work out of. And I've talked enough. So any questions? Be glad to answer questions.
I have a question to break the ice.
Sure.
Pond, you got a lot of ice up there. Red Cross. Deal with the Red Cross at all?
Probably one of our primary volunteer organizations we work with. So the Red Cross is very instrumental during the response phase with shelters. They also deliver a lot of meals, water, clothing, you name it. What people need if they've been impacted by an event like this. So I believe during the height of the response, we had 26 shelters open. A majority of those were being operated by the Red Cross. They also go in and help us with damage surveys or surveys for the individual assistance program. So they'll go up and they'll set up what's called a multi-resource center, MRCs. That is a location that they'll set up in a community. Folks could come in and they can ask for assistance. What do I need? And typically it's a coalition of volunteer agencies or organizations that will collaborate and provide those services. So if you come in with a checklist of things you need, they'll go through your list and they'll try to help you identify where those resources exist through volunteer organizations, and typically at no cost. So I can give you all kinds of examples how we work with volunteer groups, but it's not unusual with a flooding event. We had groups that came in, faith-based organizations. Another one is Team Rubicon, which are retired military veterans. They'll come in and they'll clean somebody's basement out. What we call mucking operation. They'll muck out the basements, they'll get it cleaned up, and they'll restore it. They'll tear out drywall, they'll replace it, and then another group will come in and say, you need a new furnace, we'll take care of that. You need a new hot water heater, we'll take care of that. You need a new kitchen, we'll take care of that. That happens. And it's pretty phenomenal to watch. And those are just volunteer groups. We work with them, we help facilitate each of our missions, but they're an invaluable partner.
Yeah, that's really touching. I hear that. Comments, questions? Let me get you over here. As I'm walking, I looked at those rivers, and of course they're lakes, aren't they?
Yeah.
They're not rivers.
So you kind of talked about it a little bit, but since OFFIT's considered like a federal, since it's STRATCOM,
Yep.
would that, if a natural disaster were to occur at that, would that just completely skip the state level and go automatically to
Yeah, typically
federal
the
assistance?
military will take care of their stuff. Now, we will help with, maybe they have airmen or soldiers that are impacted and they live off base. I mean, we will facilitate or coordinate with them, take care of their workforce, but the infrastructure themselves, they take care of that. You know, I can give you another example. In I think it was 2017, I think tornadoes went through, it hit Offutt, did quite a bit of damage, actually damaged aircraft. But it hit several housing areas in that Bellevue, Sarpy County area. And quite honestly, we had nothing to do with the damage on the base, but we did with facilities off base.
All righty, thank you. Question here.
Do you know what the plans are for the Spencer Dam? Because I heard that they probably weren't going to rebuild it, but I don't know if maybe you know anything different.
There are meetings. I'm not directly tied into any of those. So the structure is owned by Nebraska Public Power District. So the big question is, do they rebuild? That was a 90-year-old piece of infrastructure. It was a hydroelectric facility, still operational. Right before the event hit, they were in discussions with 2 different natural resource districts to transfer ownership of the dam to them. So I don't know what they're going to do. So the question is, do they rebuild or do they do demolition and take that structure out of the river and restore the river? I don't know what they're going to do. The last I heard is that they are going to engage a consulting group to come in and take a look at those 2 scenarios and try to do the cost-benefit analysis and determine, you know, what the FEMA dollars would help them do, or, you know, what the other strategy looks like in terms of cost. So there's no decision on that. I would hate to hazard a guess, but those are the 2 options.
So I live on the Missouri River, and we get flooded, like we get some flooding usually every year. So I was wondering how much you work with the Gavin's Point Dam. And I don't know, like, if you guys have talks on controlling how much water they release and how that, like, affects our farmers on the river.
Sure. So the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers controls all that infrastructure on the upper Missouri River Basin. So there's 5 dams. Gavin's Point's the last one. Of course, the challenge for them this year has been trying to address capacity. So last winter with the runoff, the challenge was you had additional water coming down all the streams and rivers in Nebraska and the interior, the core of the state, getting into the Missouri River system. But then there's all that stuff up above us that we have no control over. So the Corps was dealing with managing the reservoirs and trying to get water downstream. So all year they've been trying to push water out of those reservoirs to establish more capacity for this next winter and spring. So they've been pushing out about 80,000 cubic feet per second, which is, that means nothing to you, other than it's about twice the amount of water that normally goes down that river system. The problem is we had a lot of levees that were compromised, either overtopped or destroyed during the flood. And so trying to get that infrastructure back in place has probably been one of their bigger challenges. But I can tell you, all the weather people are telling us the runoff that exists right now in that upper Missouri River system is they're estimating 61 million acre feet of water That is the equivalent of the runoff that occurred in the 2011 flood. That water has to go somewhere. It's there now. So that's one challenge, and then the other challenge is it's just going to be repeat flooding or recurring flooding for the foreseeable future. They'll try to push as much water out until it freezes up, and then after that, it's going to be a big challenge. So how much cold, how much precipitation we get this winter will really dictate flooding on the Missouri next spring. It's not good, and we do work with them, yeah.
Okay, I think she answered, or she asked the same question perhaps.
Yeah, big challenge.
Yeah. All right. Going once, going twice. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.